Hi, and welcome to Really Understanding Incoterms 2020, a series of comprehensive masterclasses. I'm Bob Ronai, and this is lesson number 2, format of the Incoterms 2020 book and the common articles. But first, the necessary disclaimer. I'm not a lawyer. The contents of this course are not legal advice. I was a member of the International Chamber of Commerce's Incoterms 2020 drafting group, which created these rules. Some of the contents of this lesson are direct quotes from the Incoterms 2020 publication, number 723E of the International Chamber of Commerce. My explanations, comments, and opinions are based on my knowledge and my experience of over 5 decades. My intent in creating this comprehensive course on Incoterms 2020 is to ensure that my knowledge and my experience is passed on to you for a better future for you in trade. Format of the book. The book starts with a comprehensive introduction by Professor Charles D. Battista, the ICC's Special Advisor to the Incoterms 2020 drafting group. Each rule is prefaced by comprehensive explanatory notes for users which are not part of the actual rules, and there are numerous basic diagrams to assist understanding those notes. And then there are the articles themselves. But first, the 11 rules. They're divided into 2 distinct groups. Rules for any mode or modes of transport. EXW. Ex-works, FCA, free carrier, CPT, carriage paid to, CIP, carriage and insurance paid to, DAP, delivered at place, DPU, delivered at place unloaded, and DDP, delivered duty paid. And the other group, rules for sea or inland waterway transport. FAS, free alongside ship, FOB, free on board, CFR, cost and freight, and CIF, cost, insurance and freight. Obligations and articles within each rule. Each rule is split into 2 sets of obligations. A equals the seller's obligations. B equals the buyer's obligations. In the book, these are on facing pages, sellers on the left page and buyers on the right page. In each set of obligations, there are 10 matching articles. A1 and B1, general obligations. A2 and B2, delivery and taking delivery. A3 and B3, transfer of risks. A4, B4, carriage. A5 and B5, insurance. A6 and B6, delivery and transport document. A7 and B7, export and import clearance. A8 and B8, checking, packaging, marking. A9 and B9, allocation of costs. And A10 and B10, notices. Similarities and differences in the articles across the rules. Some articles are identical for each rule. Some articles are slightly or somewhat different for each rule. And some articles are what makes each rule different from the others, particularly A2 and B2 and A5 and B5. So we'll look at these. A1 and B1, general obligations. All rules. A1, the seller must provide the goods and the commercial invoice in conformity with a contract of sale and any other evidence of conformity that may be required by the contract. B1, the buyer must pay the price of the goods as provided in the contract of sale. And both of these provide that any document may be in paper or electronic form as agreed, or where there's no agreement, as is customary. So the obligation on the seller is to provide the goods as described in the contract, and they must provide only the invoice plus any document which shows conformity of the goods with the contract, which might be an inspection certificate from an inspection company or an analysis certificate from a laboratory, but only if agreed in the contract. The buyer's obligation is only to pay the price of the goods, but when, how and where are outside of these rules and should be specified in the contract itself. A8 and B8, checking, packaging, marking. All rules. A8, the seller must pay the costs of those checking operations, such as checking quality, measuring, weighing, counting, that are necessary for the purpose of delivering the goods in accordance with A2. The seller must, at its own cost, package the goods, unless it's usual for the particular trade to transport the type of goods sold unpackaged. The seller must package and mark the goods in the manner appropriate for their transport, unless the parties have agreed on specific packaging or marking requirements. B8, the buyer has no obligation to the seller. There's a possible point of confusion. Goods in A1, A8 and A2. In A1, the seller must provide the goods in conformity with the contract. In A8, the seller must package the goods, and A2, the seller must deliver the goods. So we have the goods in unpackaged form needing packaging in A8, and the goods presumably packaged in A1 and A2. A3 and B3, transfer of risks. All rules. A3, the seller bears all risks of loss of or damage to the goods until they have been delivered in accordance with A2, with the exception of loss or damage in the circumstance described in B3. Now, B3 varies with the rule. The buyer bears all risk of loss of or damage to the goods from the time they've been delivered by the seller under A2, plus if the buyer fails to carry out its obligations under other articles, depending on the rule, then it also bears all risks of loss of or damage to the goods. A4 and B4. The seller contracts for carriage to the named place of destination in CPT, CIP, DAP, DPU and DDP, or to the port of destination in CFR and CIF. The buyer contracts for carriage from the named place in X-Works and FCA, or named port in FAS and FOB. A5 and B5 insurance. All rules except CIP and CIF. The seller has no obligation to the buyer to insure the goods. Only in CIP and CIF does the seller have the obligation to insure. And this is because the risk transfers to the buyer at delivery. In CIP and CIF, the seller has the obligation to insure for the buyer's risk. B5, the buyer has no obligation to insure. But in CIP, CIF and the 3D rules, the buyer must provide information to the seller, if requested, to enable the seller to insure. A7 and B7 export-import clearance. X works. Export, transshipment and import formalities, all for the buyer. F and C rules, export formalities for the seller, any transshipment and import formalities for the buyer. DAP and DPU, export and transshipment formalities for the seller and import formalities for the buyer. And DDP, export, transshipment and import formalities for the seller. So two rules are particularly difficult. Ex Works requires the buyer itself to arrange export formalities, which is usually either impossible or very difficult. DDP requires the seller itself to arrange import formalities and pay VAT or GST, which is usually either impossible or very difficult. Most countries require the party carrying out customs formalities to be a legal entity in that country and registered there for VAT or GST. Next lesson, we'll look at EXW, the more complex and contentious articles, especially A2 and B2, delivery and taking delivery. These are where the legal concept of delivery often does not adequately explain the real-world logistics actualities of delivery. Then for this rule, we'll look at A6 and B6, delivery and transport document, A9 and B9, allocation of costs, and A10 and B10, notices. I'll explain what the book says first, which is where other trainers and YouTube videos usually stop, but then I'll examine the issues arising from each article as we go along. If you like this lesson, please click on the thumbs up button below. If you'd like to be alerted to each new lesson, please hit the subscribe button and the bell. And please leave any comments and questions relevant to this lesson below. Till next lesson, see you then.